The G20 foreign ministers will meet in Johannesburg later this week. The meeting will be held at Nasrec under the theme Solidarity, Equality, Sustainability. It'll be the first time South Africa has hosted a G20 event. Pretoria has been clear that its G20 presidency is a valuable opportunity to place the needs of Africa and the rest of the global South more firmly on the international development agenda. South Africa assumed the presidency of the G20 on the 1st of December last year, and to unpack the significance of the event, we are joined by the Director of Global Government Affairs and CSR at SAP Africa, Sunil Geness. Sunil, great to have you. Thanks for chatting to us.
Thank you, Leanne, and good morning to the viewers.
I mean, this certainly is a landmark event for South Africa and basically the entire African continent. Perhaps that's where we should start, about the significance of this for us.
Absolutely, Leanne. South Africa, being the first African country to chair the G20 in itself, is a landmark, and it's a monumental year for South Africa, having been part of a process which has led to the prior G20s in Indonesia, then in India, then in Brazil in more recent times last year. And of course, carrying that torch into 2025 with this presidency, a critical moment for South Africa as the world faces many, many challenges. South Africa itself at the heart of driving many initiatives on the African continent. And if one just looks at the actual agenda for South Africa, one can tear this in three pieces. The first piece being the global agenda. Dealing with the entire globe at stake. And then within that, a subset being the global South. The second agenda point critical to South Africa is the African continent and its interface with the African Union. We know more recently that the African Union had its elections just recently, and South Africa featured prominently in many of the discussions, the side discussions that took place during that time. And then if we drop down to the third and not the least important, which is the domestic agenda of South Africa. And we saw that clearly articulated by President Ramaphosa in his recent State of the Nation address, where he put at the center of everything South Africa's growth ambitions, South Africa's ambitions to be a leader on the continent, the economic emancipation, and the person on the street, the ultimate beneficiary of all of these actions is to ensure that South Africa remains competitive and that our citizens are able to benefit from these actions that are being taken and the platform that South Africa has been given.
Well, I mean, let's talk about that, because I think, we all ask the question, can South Africa seize this moment? It is an important moment to shape the agenda. Or will this presidency be overwhelmed by domestic fragilities, regional tensions, global power shifts? There's so much at play at the moment.
Absolutely, Leanne. And you're seeing now what is emerging on the global stage is that South Africa has undertaken discussions with Canada, and that has been well received. More recently with the European Union, and as President Ramaphosa also indicated, that he has many emissaries that are going around the continent and the globe at large, which is a combination of public sector or elected officials and a private sector, to understand what the key issues and nubs of issues are on the continent and the globe at large. So those data sets that are brought back into the mix are going to be inculcated into the G20 agenda. Now, we must keep in mind that so much is happening with South Africa, which is engaged in bilateral relationships with the U.S. We know that President Donald Trump has delivered an executive order, so to speak, which in many ways places pressure on South Africa's relationship and funding, which comes to the continent at large, South Africa's ability to attract funding to PEPFAR, etc. But those matters, and a credit to our South African government, they are dealing with those matters on a bilateral relationship basis. And those are being unraveled as we speak. But at the same time, South Africa, on the flip side, has strengthened relationships outside of the U.S. environment itself with other powers, the global powers, China, India, the Russia, and many of the other leading nations in both the G7 and the G20. So we're seeing that this meeting of foreign affairs ministers, which will take place in the days coming up, as being critical for South Africa to cement further strength relationships with other trade partners, with other trade blocs, and at the same time to reestablish itself as a leading light on the African continent. And a subset of that, Leanne, which is important, is the infrastructure that South Africa has and has boasted for a long period of time. Of course, we need to renew that. But that is an area that we believe will feature strongly in the discussions that take place outside of the separate bilateral engagements that are happening to influence a global agenda.
So let's get back to the issue of the US and what's happening behind the scenes with South Africa and comments coming from the US. And then, of course, we learned that the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, will not be attending the meeting, citing this Expropriation Act. I know you did mention this, but there has now, of course, been a confirmation from the Department of International Relations confirming that the US will have a representative at that meeting. So they will be present there. But do you think that the Trump administration, which, by the way, the US takes over this presidency the end of this year, do you think the Trump administration is trying to throw South Africa's presidency into a tailspin?
Not so much as that, Leanne, but more about the fact that this presidency is so recent. And, people always talk about the first 100 days of a president. And you'll see that many of these actions that are being taken by President Trump and his administration are seeking to deliver outputs and outcomes for the man on the street in the United States, or who is considered to be the forgotten person. So this is a period of high velocity, high transactional engagements that are unfolding. And it is unfortunate that South Africa is caught within this sort of loop that is happening right now. But if you look back and one reflects on some of the actions undertaken by the Trump administration, particularly with Canada, and how that was resolved over a relatively short period of time, there is a belief structure amongst the various parties, both stakeholders, lobby groups, etc., that this is a quick sort of methodology that's being used to create a volition towards the strategies that the American presidency has put in place. It does dim to some extent South Africa's G20 presidency, but at the same time, with every challenge, there is the opportunity for South Africa to strengthen its position by being able to drive very strategically. The African Trade Accord, which has been set up, is there to see. The least amount of trade takes place between intra-African trade. And there's a huge opportunity for African countries to utilize this G20 presidency for South Africa to drive that, to increase sustainability of these countries. So whilst there may be these so-called executive orders placed on South Africa, and South Africa is not alone. I mean, there's tons of it happening in other parts of the world as part of President Trump's administration and what he's trying to achieve. The focus needs to be on South Africa being able to provide tangible outputs at the end of this presidency, keeping in mind that a G20, and particularly for our views as well, it doesn't shift and change its direction radically, because the Sherpas of the G20 sit down together and agree on key outcomes and processes and the focal areas. And in that regard, South Africa has to carry that torch, and with that comes the support from the rest of the world. And maybe the last point on that particular matter is South Africa's own ability to increase its domestic agenda and the impact thereof. The president mentioned things such as digital public infrastructure that he wants to focus on. And we know the world is moving rapidly in the direction. The artificial intelligence influence on the continent will continue to increase. And South Africa has a golden opportunity to harmonize many of its regulations in data and cloud, and more particularly the draft artificial intelligence policy framework that has been put in place. to advantage South Africa in a way that we can bring our citizens into the digital economy in a proper way, that they have a fair share of the addressable market that is out there.
Finally, very quickly, please, we've got less than a minute. I mean, when we look at our relations now, I mean, we've received backing from major economies. We know we're part of BRICS, China, Russia, other major trading partners like the European Union, China as well. I mean, will these countries fill the gap, perhaps, by the US at these G20 foreign ministers meetings?
Absolutely. China is here on a mission, for sure. We know the Chinese foreign minister is set to meet potentially with the foreign minister from South Korea on the sidelines. But South Africa is a key trading partner, although as we say, the imports that we undertake with China exceed our exports at the moment. But China is looking to increase its global influence, particularly in the technology arena. We saw what DeepSeek did in recent times, taking trillions of dollars off the US stock exchange. So the advantage that China wants to drive home is to be able to proliferate the world with its technologies, also with its product portfolio, but at the same time, Africa and South Africa remains a rich, quote-unquote, hunting ground for key minerals and resources that China itself will require. Okay. So definitely China is pushing that agenda. At the same time, keeping in mind, and this is a concluding statement, that China and the US will meet. These are giants of the global economy. They will meet at some point to talk about the world at large, as we are seeing the United States president trying to achieve that agenda also with the Russian president, with meetings that are currently taking place in Saudi Arabia.
We have got an interesting year ahead of us, we really do. And it's, I suppose, our do or die moment, isn't it? This is where we really need to bring the agenda very, very fast and furiously to the rest of the world as we assume this presidency. Sunil Geness, who's the Director of Global Government Affairs and CSR at SAP Africa, thank you. Thanks very much for talking to us.